6, so I'm going to call this meeting to order, and I'm going to go through and take roll here for Connie. I'll take roll so that way it can be reflected in the minutes. Good morning, everybody. If I haven't said that already, we'll try this IT. I was thinking, Zoom, I certainly appreciate the technology that we have. Save a lot of driving for me, and I know for others today, and it just seemed appropriate. I think we've discussed this before, that prefer in-person, eyeball to eyeball, as I say, but I think we'll get along well today, and it'll be a shorter meeting than meetings in the future, and some of those meetings might even need to be extended longer once we get into RFPs and especially the next phase of developing some sort of a long-range plan. So thank you again for joining, and as I mentioned, several others will be joining us a little bit late. So I'm just going to go down the list, and if you just would respond here, if you are here. So Sandra?
Here.
Robin? Gary, I know, will not be here. Lori?
Here.
Monica?
Good morning, I'm here.
Morning. Sarah, I believe she's running a little bit late. She had something come up, so she'll be joining us. I think she's going to be there in person. Mike, is Mike Brower
here?
Mike Kage? Keith will not be here. Jason joined us.
Here.
Good morning.
Morning.
As I mentioned, this will be a little shorter meeting, I believe, than what we've done here recently. So we will just pretty much go through this and won't pause for a break unless it feels like we need to do that. But I will remind you that if you can keep your microphones on mute unless you are talking, I'll try to keep track. I know Krista and Connie's going to help me. If you have a question as we get into this, to raise your hand either virtually or on your screen, and then I'll call upon you so we can keep order here. And we'll remind you that we'll follow the Robert's Rules of Order. The first order of business is to review the minutes, and then I will ask for a motion to approve those. So those were sent out here earlier in the week. If anybody wants to make that motion, and the second will entertain.
Motion to approve the minutes from last meeting.
I'll second.
Lori moves and Sandra seconds. Any discussion in regards to the minutes? All in favor of approving the minutes? Aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. All right, thank you. Chris will have an update from the Attorney General's office. Chris, we'll just turn to you now.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So not a lot to update from the AG's office. We did get the annual report submitted last week. Just a brief update on that. There was some minor errors that we're getting corrected on the municipal side, so that's going to be a bit delayed. That's statutorily not required as part of the board's report to the legislature, to the governor, to the AG's office. So the AG's office is gonna submit that or publicly publish that at a later date. One other thing that I know, there's been some requests to get the opioid website updated. We have finished that update As of yesterday, I believe, I've got most of the information from the last board meetings and some updated information about how to get access to the RFP added to the website. That's at ag.ks.gov/opioids. One thing we would request from the board is if you all could send either to myself or to Connie, probably to Connie first, and then she can forward it on to me, a 2 to 3 sentence bio about yourselves, specifically kind of identifying your experience in this space. And if you have any links to more detailed bios on one of your organization's websites, we would appreciate that. We'll get that updated and added to the website. We currently list the board members and just who appoints the board member, and we would probably like to get a little bit more information on the website for that. The only other update is that we are rolling along with getting the cities and counties to sign some just minor paperwork as part of our settlement process for the next 5 settlements, and we'll go into more details on that probably in the May meeting after that process has completed. That's all I've got, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chris. Any questions for Chris? Seeing none, we'll move into the next portion of our meeting. Krista and Brandon from Sunflower will lead that. And Krista, are you going to go first?
Yep. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. And I think Brandon is going to get out of it again this time.
What?
Yeah, and another reason for the shorter meeting is the review process, which I'll get into more, but I wanted to give you guys a quick update on the request for proposals. As you know, it went out on the 6th, so earlier this week. And so far, we've received 15 confirmation of intents. One of them was a for-profit entity that recognizes they weren't eligible, but still wanted to put something in there and to make it known that there are entities out there that are for-profits that could benefit. And so they have a comment in there and whatnot. So technically 14 that are eligible. And then for the first webinar, we have 47 registered already. The second webinar, we have 10 registered. And then in our actual grants management system, they can actually register in advance, but they can't access the online application until the 21st, but they can actually get set up in the with an account in the system. And we have 3 of those already registered in the system and ready to go when the application button comes live on the 21st. So just update there on what response we've gotten so far with RFP. So with the review process, we are thinking that we could talk about it further in this meeting and try to hammer down what we might want that to be. However, not knowing how many applications we'll get, it might be kind of difficult for us to do so and come up with some real feasible options of what we want to do. And so Brandon and I are thinking maybe in the April-May meeting, we spend more time thinking about that, because if we get 30 applications, that's a lot more reasonable, and maybe we have the board have a more active role if you guys wanted to, versus if we get 200 applications, that's going to be unfeasible. And so we're hoping that the confirmation of intent being due March 30th, we'll be able to have enough information knowing how many applicants to expect that we can give you actual feasible options for what the review process could look like, and for you all to decide on which route you'd like to take. So that's why it's super short, and Brandon gets out of having to speak unless you guys have specific questions today.
Questions? Krista, just so I'm clear, I believe I followed this, but so anyone wanting to apply is asked to let that intention be known before I think they have a couple weeks or something. I'm not sure of the date, and then the actual application is not due for another 45 days or so.
Yeah, so we have the confirmation of intent, which is just a survey monkey. It just asks name of organization, the type of organization they are, what strategy areas they're interested in, and any additional, or their primary contact and additional information. So it should take them a minute or less. And so that's just a survey that's due March 30th so that we can get an idea of how many to expect application-wise to plan for the review process. And then the actual application's not due until April 28th.
Okay. I also had some questions and just throw something out about, some or all of our members on this committee work with or for organizations that perhaps might make applications or be asked to help with an application. My thought, and certainly welcome others, would be, that would be anticipated. The expertise that we've gathered on the board would, a lot of that comes from the work that you do with the state. And if your organization that you are on the board or, work for makes application, or if you're asked by other organizations, my experience when I was at the Department of Commerce was that programs that we would, put up for RFP similar to this, we would get a lot of questions from applicants of staff, and we encouraged, our staff to help out and be part of that application process, just to make sure that they're going in the right direction. So my thought was, as long as that was identified and you would recuse yourself when we get to the actual voting, and we're still, as Krista just said, we'll know precisely how the review process will be after the April meeting. But if your organization that you're part of in somehow, some way, is one of the applicants, that you would recuse yourself from the actual vote on approval of those applications. So that would just be my suggestion, and welcome anybody else to comment.
Mr. Chair, this is Robert Hutchison. I just have a couple of thoughts on that.
Sure.
Getting disclosure as soon as someone does start to work with an applicant would be good, so we can keep track of that. And any board members who are either working with entities or, are part of an entity itself that is applying should also be careful not to share what you might call insider information from the board, anything that's not public and part of the application, or something that they can't answer just based off the statute or the contents of the application form. Just to make sure we have those clear lines. And finally, not to anyone who is assisting another entity with an application should not, in an informal capacity or formal capacity at the board, discuss that application with other board members.
Thank you. And Robert, would you mind, maybe Connie could just send those out to the board, those suggestions that you just made, just to remind us?
Yeah, I'll send her something to send out.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, this is Monica.
Yes, Monica.
I kind of had in my head that if there were questions, they would be directed to Sunflower about specifics. That seems to make it pretty clear. So I've had a few people say, "What do you know about this? Is this the board you're on?" I guess, and Sunflower is managing it, and here's where questions are directed. So I don't know. I kind of had in my head that we wouldn't probably answer a lot of questions, but just, forward them on. But appreciate that we will need to step out if it is an organization we're involved with.
That sounds like an excellent suggestion to me. Takes us off the hook, and plus also gives them a source for, technical advice.
Well, and we can be assured that people are all getting the same information. So fairness in the process.
Sure. Any other comments?
Mr. Chair, this is
Well,
Chris.
I would say, I don't know if we need to adopt that formally, Robert, but I certainly agree with Monica's suggestion that if, as a board member, I'm approached on, any kind of technical advice on an application, that we would just refer them to Sunflower.
If you want that to be the actual board policy, such that that's what any board member should do, then yes, that would need to be a formal adoption as a policy of the board. If that's more just a practice guideline and not something you want as a strict rule, then no.
What do you think? Should we make that policy or informal? Why don't we make it policy? It just sounds like the right thing to do.
Chairman, this is Mike Brower. I agree with that. I employed by Johnson County government, and so which has multiple departments and agencies. So I think the clearer we draw the lines, the less opportunity there is for any just even accusations of not being fair.
Mr. Chair, this is Sarah. I would
Yes.
agree with you. I think it's not only best practice, I think it's just the way to start this whole process out on the right foot. So if no one else has a comment, I will certainly make that motion.
Okay. Entertain the motion.
Monica, second.
Have motion by Sarah, Monica seconds. Any further discussion?
Mr.
All
Chair,
in
could you
favor?
repeat the motion?
Aye. Excuse me.
Do you want us to vote before? I think Connie was looking for us to repeat the motion.
Okay, yeah, go ahead and repeat the motion if you want, Sarah.
Perfect. Thank you for giving me that opportunity. I want you to know how much I appreciate that this Friday morning. My motion would be that we direct all calls or all questions and inquiries to Sunflower regarding grant applications.
Second by Monica. Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye.
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 Opposed? Same sign. Unanimous? Thank you. The next thing, just for, we spent a little bit of time last meeting talking about scheduling testimony. I'm sure most of you have been approached. I know the AG's office has been approached, and as we go forward, we'll have more and more. I think we're undecided as far as entities that have made application. Do we want to hear from them in person, or would that be an option, I guess, of the reviewers, maybe even outside of the board, or perhaps we need to do that within a board meeting. So I would suggest that Krista and Connie be the people that we would forward, or that they would keep requests. And then either as a board or, a few of us, we could decide what testimony that would perhaps fit in and guide us going forward. And perhaps if we hear some testimony from people that have made application, we could maybe split up into subcommittees and do some Zoom review that way. I'm just kind of talking out loud here, so I'm going to pause, and if anyone has comments in that regard, please speak up.
Mr.
Sandra?
Chair, the only note I'll make is that, subcommittees, meeting like that would be a great and efficient way. Just remember that the Open Meetings Act would still apply to meetings of those subcommittees and any deliberations by them.
Okay, thank you. Sandra?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. My only comment would be, if we are allowing folks to give testimony regarding application, it seems to me we would need to be consistent and have everybody give testimony, so that one entity is not seen as favored, or that they are providing additional information to us that others who aren't giving testimony don't have the opportunity to do. So to me, consistency would be important.
I agree
What's
with
your thoughts on whether we should entertain testimony from applicants?
This is Monica, and I've thought about this since the last time we were together. You know, what seems to be a, simple suggestion of being able to hear from people. I have a bit of a concern about that. I feel like something about it doesn't feel right. But to Sandra's point, if we do one, we need to allow all. And if we're looking at 100 applications right now, not sure if that's quite manageable. Or, well, I know it's not manageable. And I have a bit of a concern of breaking into subgroups, that it just seems like maybe we should just put this on hold maybe while we're accepting applications. If they've applied. But then I flip over and out of the other side of my mouth, I think, okay, if somebody has vital information that it's generic in nature, right? At some point I would like to hear that, as far as the continuing education of the board. But right now I'm kind of switching my thought from last time. But whatever we do, I will reiterate, we cannot, expect people to always drive to Topeka. We cannot expect people to provide testimony 24 hours in advance, that we just told them about, some of those things that I mentioned earlier. I'm still sticking to those, even though I'm kind of flip-flopping on you, Mr. Chair.
No, those are pretty much replicate my thought process too. It's in the legislature, you're meeting 3 or 4 or 5 times a week. And so to give everybody a chance to come up there and give, in-person testimony or written testimony, it's a little easier to manage. And remember too, that the way that I look at this is this first phase where we're doing RFP 1 and 2 for some immediate deployment of capital to make a difference. The second phase, the long-term plan, perhaps would be more appropriate to have our partners from around the state. If they have if they're doing something that maybe we want to incorporate on a wider basis or some innovation, perhaps then we could solicit their testimony and input. Other thoughts?
Mr. Chair, this is Sarah. I'm wondering if it might not just be a good way to start out by just really looking at the rubric that has been put together on scoring for the grants. Use that as just really our jumping off point and seeing how that works. And then if we need to modify, we modify. But I mean, the rubric was put together for a reason, and we need to honor the scoring and all of that will be determined on each applicant. And what I'd hate to happen is that we change the tool that we have approved just because an individual comes in and does testimony, or all the individuals come in and do testimony. We all know that some people present really well, some people don't. Some people write really well, some people don't. It doesn't mean that their idea is any more or less valid, but I just wonder if we might not just want to start out with what we've already approved and then see if we need to modify for the next additional phases.
Sounds good to me. Any other comments?
This is Jason. I would echo what Sarah said. And question whether we would want to have a lot of testimony before this initial RFP process is completed anyway. When I look at who some of this money is going to be targeted for and how we may end up putting it out there eventually on a more long-term basis, I would want to hear testimony between times before the next set of requests or proposals comes in, because what I don't think we want to do is to say, well, we want to hear testimony, but we don't want to hear from any of the people that might get the money eventually sometime, which quite frankly is who I want to hear from. I I don't think it's appropriate to be hearing from those folks that may be applying for money now. But how do we mitigate that? Well, the way you mitigate that is you award the money, and then you start hearing testimony that may impact the next round of funding that we do. And so you have sort of a both and so I think that seems to be a way to look at it a little differently. Monica, I agree with you completely. It's an easy one to flip back and forth on. But I think it's really important that we hear from the field and what they're seeing in the field. And if we say, well, if you're a nonprofit entity and you're only eligible for this money, we can't hear from you. If there's an outside chance you might apply, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot. So it may be a push pause on hearing some of that testimony until after this first round is done.
Thank you, Jason. It feels like we're consistent in that we want to pause on testimony from anybody that is an applicant or potential applicant, at least this first round. And then we can, as Sarah mentioned, we can always modify in the future.
Mr. Chair, this is Chris. The AG's office had a couple questions that were raised by the public on this that I just wanted to pass along and see if there may be an opportunity for clarity. Specifically, if a person is affiliated with an organization that is potentially going to apply for a grant, but is not actually a part of the management structure of that organization or as part of the grant application process. There was a question on whether or not they would be able to present or submit a proposal to present without impacting their organization's ability to receive a grant.
Any thoughts around that? I guess just to start off, if by affiliation, I don't know if we need to define that or not, but I'll stand down, and if anybody has a comment around those lines, please.
Yeah,
Welcome.
I have just a logistical comment. So we only meet once a month. How many meetings are we talking about when these grants are open? It seems like we may, if it's like, okay, in our April meeting, is that the only meeting that we're talking about, not being able to have testimony? Or pausing?
At the April meeting, we'll have a good idea of the number of applicants, and we can talk about this further. I believe what the board is suggesting is that we pause now and not take any testimony from any applicants or potential applicants, and then we can modify as we go forward. It seems like we we don't want to eliminate getting testimony from people, that would be beneficial to us, but at the same time, not to compromise and all of a sudden feel compelled to open it up to every applicant, will come before us just from a logistical standpoint.
I understand that. I was just thinking in response to Chris's question, seems to me we would just tell those people, well, we're not taking testimony, and they come back next time we're taking testimony.
I have no problem with that. Chris, does that suffice that at this point we're not taking testimony, but we might modify in the future?
I think that's sufficient for us to be able to answer that question. And if they wish to request the opportunity, we will direct them to submit those requests to Krista and Connie so that those can be on hand when the board is ready to request additional testimony.
Okay. Any other questions or comments around this about future testimony or meetings? If not, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll get back and hear from We have 4 people that are going to give testimony along the lines of lived experience. So we'll pause here for 5 minutes. And it is 9:30, so about 9:35. I want to welcome the conferees, Pablo Mose, Mike Grover, Clayton Carr, and Chris Wilkins. Chris, I don't believe, has joined us. He's out on the West Coast, but I expect him to join with us. We have him scheduled to go last. I appreciate each of you taking the time to share your personal experience. I know that you each have not just your personal experience, but a broader view of this addiction disease that we're dealing with, and perhaps experiences that you've had, both as somebody that works in recovery or been around recovery, and thoughts that you see that things that are effective or things that are not too effective, but roadblocks to keeping people alive and helping people get into recovery. So again, thank you for taking the time. And for the committee, we've asked the conferees to speak 10 to 15 minutes, and if there's any questions at that time, they'll take them, or perhaps at the end of the all of their testimonies if there's any follow-up questions. But with that being said, I'll ask each of the conferees just to give a brief 1 minute background. I know you've sent in a short bio that was distributed to the committee, and just tell us from your experience with this disease, anything that you think would be pertinent for our committee. So thank you. And Pablo, if you want to unmute, and you can begin.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm Pablo Mose. I'm an attorney with the Rapine Brothers firm. I'm a partner here, but more importantly, I'm an alcoholic and an addict, and I have had a string of lifetime experiences in different spheres and populations that have really shown me the scope of the disease, that it does not discriminate. I grew up, my dad's an immigrant, my mom's a Mexican American, and I grew up I've lived in a diagonal line in Kansas. So I was born in Topeka, moved next to Liberal, Kansas at the bottom corner. And I actually came to Dodge City after living in Kansas City. And so if you stretch where I've lived, there's a diagonal line, across the state. But also I've been around all the kind of socioeconomic groups and classes, and seen the impact of addiction in my own life as well as in those around me. So I grew up as a poor Mexican kid in a trailer park, and I just seeing law enforcement come through, and the impact of addiction is common. It's very common. And through a series of experiences, and just kind of the right things falling into place at the right time, I graduated from Emporia high school, and then I got my bachelor's at Emporia State University, and then went to law school at the University of Kansas. And I say this stuff not to say, hey, look at me, because it's not anything that I sit here and I'm like, oh, it's because I'm great. I look and I think, despite all this stuff falling into place for me, this disease of addiction nearly killed me. And I've seen that same impact in other people's lives. I'm fortunate to have had resources that I think that this committee and this grant pool would seek to provide for people who aren't that fortunate, for what is, according to the CDC, the top cause of death, right? So I graduated the top of my class in law school. I went to work at a national firm that's based out of Kansas City. They have a national practice, and that is where this disease started to explode. You would think that someone who graduated at the top of their class in law school would be able to figure it out. Okay, well, this stuff is leading me into bad places, but I was baffled, and that is the nature of this disease. I remember taking like a DARE class in fifth grade, right? A drug awareness, resistance, and education, but that is different from what happens if you have this condition, right? I thought it was always a matter of willpower and choice. I did not understand, and I had never been taught about the disease of addiction, that it has this, you know, obsessive impulse. If I have like diabetes, you know, I have to control my diet. But what I don't have is, you know, a voice inside my head telling me to eat sugar nonstop, you know, and that real presence of a disease is what the data is, you know, seems to confirm, because at that point where it sure looks like everything should have been clear and together, and you know, I have this what I would call like the dream job that you'd imagine, you know, in law school. If I could have any job, it'd be this one, you know, and they hire very few people, and that's what I had, and it was even more baffling though. And so I saw, as I began to interact with people, I would see that something was just a little off about a group of people that was familiar to me from my upbringing, right? And it's the disease of addiction, the impact of it at a level where you've got people who are educated, who are, you know, financially well, and have thriving careers, but it's the same addiction. It's the same addiction. You can just tell, almost like if you don't have the disease, it's hard to spot because it really tries to conceal itself. And so, you know, you try all these different adjustments and measurements. Well, you know, let me try toning it down here, or changing this or changing that, but it just follows, and it shows up again. And next thing you know, it is taken over. And you really can't stop. You're forced to stop. Something forces you to stop because it is not a sustainable lifestyle. So I went from Kansas City, and I had an opportunity to take the job I currently have in Dodge City, and I don't do any criminal defense. I just do civil stuff. Yet, uh, when I came to Dodge City, it wasn't through my work, is what I'm saying. It was, you know, this disease followed me from Kansas City to Dodge City, and it started to pop back up again. And on my, you know, drive down here for the first day of my first hearing, I drove it. I passed out, and I crashed into a semi truck head on, and got life flighted from there to you know, the hospital. And um, it was kind of a, you know, a wake up call, that something is. I mean, I knew for years that something was going on that I just couldn't put my finger on. But I was fortunate to have a very, you know, understanding boss who connected me with the local AA group, and that was life changing. It was like finding answers that I couldn't find in a book. I couldn't find from studying, and I'm familiar with studying. I mean, I kind of read for my profession. I write, and it's, you'd think I would have stumbled across something that would have, you know, been an aha moment, but there is something about the community strength. So as I've, you know, gotten active in the recovery community, I have, it's just it hits a sweet spot in my heart. It answers so many things, but at the same time, it requires a whole lot of work, and it's not an individual program. It's a collective program. And I've, you know, been able to have a terrific sponsor who's walked me through the steps. And I've, you know, been able to sponsor other people. And one thing that has really stood out to me is the lack of resources, because I am like incredibly fortunate and still almost died. I mean, I was like, you know, I think 14 inches either way from where I hit the semi, and I'm dead. And you know, there was a lot of other things that were still, you know, going south, right? And yet, it's like I had the ideal set of circumstances for someone to have the best shot, and that is so incredibly rare. I think you have better odds winning the Powerball than those things coming together. And I see without having this kind of, you know, everything coming together, it's really, really difficult to find resources, especially for people in poverty in rural areas, which I see on a daily basis because I live here. In Dodge City, your average person would have not only a language barrier, you know, a person who has a disease of addiction, but not only have a language barrier, but a, you know, a resource barrier. And then even if there's a way to get into a treatment facility, you're up against a lack of staffing, right? That it's not that a treatment place is unavailable, but that they have a difficult time with, you know, the funding available to them to hire uh, enough counselors, you know, to have the funds to fill the beds. And so I think there's 50, I think they have 50 beds that they rarely fill more than 15. It's just that tight funding structure that these resources would help alleviate tremendously. It just, if you're in an urban area, it seems like, like when I was in Kansas City, there are options, but there are just not the bodies, the people to address the needs here. And so it's not uncommon to see somebody who I'll meet in a meeting who will go to treatment for 28 days. That's kind of the normal amount of time, but then they've got to come back, and there's not a continuation. And then there's also a stigma. There's an incredible stigma of admitting that I have this disease of addiction, which I didn't even understand. I had no clue that this even existed. I thought it was a matter of willpower, and I could not figure out why I couldn't muster the willpower. I did not understand that there's an active mental component. It's almost like addiction is a form of mental illness that just is ever present and gets better over time. And so there's this stigma to even get into treatment. But even if you can get past that stigma, that you face a lack of resources, that if you complete 28 days and then you got to go back to the same kind of stressful environment at home, a lot of times you can't get into a halfway house. They're all full here. Your best odds are you're getting on a waiting list for a couch spot where you sleep on a couch. I mean, that's not saying we got 5 of them. They're all full. And so you leave, and you gotta hope maybe you can go live with family or get an apartment. You got to get a job. There are just these stressors, and the continue. I mean, you likely lack the resources to get into treatment and get an effective program. And then after that, even if you get through that initial hurdle, you've got barriers to continuing that kind of care, right? And having resources available to extend it. It's not that there are not a program or a treatment option that works in theory. I mean, I think there's plenty of studies and data galore about the nature of the problem, right? But it is is there an ability to implement those, to find the people to implement those in rural settings, especially with those who are who are impoverished, who don't have insurance. I just see it over and over, and it's heartbreaking, because if there was was funding available, to help you not only impact the person, you impact a family tree, right? Because it is, and who knows if there's ever going to be a clear answer, if it's a genetic thing, if it's an environmental thing, but I mean, I think it's incredibly rare to find someone who's an alcoholic or an addict who doesn't have that surrounding them in their own family. And so to make that kind of gigantic change requires a lot of assistance and help. And my experience has been that there's a tremendous need, because all the meetings in the world are can be helpful to a person, but without the kind of foundational core resources, it's an uphill battle constantly, and it's a heartbreaking thing to see. But there are cases where there's a lot of hope. And I feel very fortunate to have had things come together that I could never have done myself. And it warms my heart, and I'm so excited to be involved in this recovery community, because it just kind of ripples out, and that's just the effect that I see. That's been my experience, and I think if you find a way to provide resources to address stigma and the extension of care, initial care in treatment, but then continuing from there, we have a good shot of making lives better for all Kansans across the state.
Thank you, Pablo. Does anyone have questions for Pablo now, or as I mentioned, we can take some time at the end of the other testimonies? Of course, I know Pablo because he's out here in Dodge City and have watched his growth and his willingness to reach out and help others. So thank you for your time this morning, Pablo, and open it up if anyone has a question for Pablo.
I have a question. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's very helpful for us to hear from people like yourself on this committee as we think about how to best use these funds. So appreciate you being here and sharing your experience with us. I was wondering, what do you think are the similarities and differences that we should be aware of in relation to your story as someone with an alcohol use disorder and someone maybe who has an opioid use disorder, who, in terms of access to care and ability to have ongoing recovery support.
Thanks, Lori. I think that's a really, excellent question, because my experience has been that, alcoholism is something that over time there's a less of a stigma to seeking help. But alcohol is a drug. It is an addiction. Alcoholism, if anything, seems to be an addiction to the drug of alcohol, right? That there is addiction to other drugs. I mean, it seems to be that they all kind of wrap in this same umbrella of addiction. As far as for my experience, which is all I can speak to, is that the same tools that I find helpful for alcoholism also are effective for other diseases. I'm certainly an alcoholic and an addict. I just through the circles that I in school, I didn't have exposure to some heavier drugs, and I'm not a heroin user. I've never been around heroin. I mean, so, but at the same time, the people who I interact with, who come into meetings, we face this same mental obsession. It's just a different substance, but it's the same core disease. And to be able to get into a group, there's so many barriers and obstacles just to get resources in through the door, that I think the stigma takes on a different color for the substances, but resources and availability of care seem to be common for all, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Pablo. Any other questions? Thank you, and hope you can stay on here till we get through, and we'll see if there's any other discussion that comes up. I think next we'll hear from Clayton Carr. If you want to give us a little bit of background, a minute or two, and then again, just your experience with the disease from a recovery standpoint, and barriers that you might see, or any other data that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to, if I could, answer Lori's question real quick that she asked Pablo about opioids. Specifically, there is a greater challenge with the opioids. There is medication-assisted treatment that is the recommended best practice for people that are withdrawing from opioids. The physiological effects of alcohol and opiates or opioids, I mean, just completely affect all body systems. And so when you're withdrawing from that and you're looking at long-term recovery, you need to look at the MAT, is what they call it, medication-assisted treatment. And it's best practice, depending on the level of usage of the opioid, as well as the length of that. The tolerance gets a lot higher. And we find, well, the industry finds that the longer you can have somebody on MAT, the more likely they're going to stay in recovery and not using those substances. It's complex, but it's also simple. Hopefully that answered some of your question. And there's specific medications that can be prescribed for that. Again, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with your committee. My experience in recovery or in addiction, I actually came to treatment, a treatment center when I was 20 years old back in 1988, which things have dramatically changed since 1988 in terms of the substances that are out there, the potency of those substances, and then the treatment aspects that have been added over the years. Really, in the last 5 years, there's been a significant increase in available services, best practices that I think the industry all agrees on. Rural communities where I grew up, not going to tell you where, but Northeast Kansas, someplace. Anyway, statute of limitations run out on everything. I'm good. That was a joke. Anyway, same, small town. That's what we did. We drank, we used as often as possible. And it didn't take long for that to cross a specific line for me. I went to basic training in AIT in 1986, and that culture, which promotes alcohol use at a high level but still function, really kind of put me to a point to where I had a full-blown addiction to just about anything and everything, but alcohol being the primary issue. I did go through a treatment center. I did not realize at the time the effect my usage had on my family. And I think Pablo alluded to that just a little bit, but there's one thing I would want everyone to understand is the effects on family members. If anybody's had somebody that had an addiction issue, it's almost similar to PTSD, if you will. You never know when that phone is going to ring and something is going to be told to you that's some really unfortunate news. And it's just a very difficult situation for the person suffering from the addiction and the people that love them. And that's a long-term process for healing. It takes some specific attention, family counseling, and repairing relationships. And in my situation, it took several years for those relationships to be mended, but they were. I attended Emporia State just like Pablo, small world. Once I realized that I could do something to help prevent or intervene in the addiction cycle for people. And so I went to Emporia State. I got my graduate and undergraduate in counseling and started working with kids specifically. And so I've got 20 some years in the state of Kansas working with juvenile offenders and children in need of care in the DCF system or the DOC system. They were different terms back in the day, SRS and JJA. But anyway, that just dated me. What I would want you to know about addiction and the processes, there are best practices. We talked about MAT, medication assisted treatment. An initial inpatient experience is going to be, right now, insurances are typically only going to cover 21, maybe 20 days of a much needed 30-day system or process. But it's really what happens after people discharge from an inpatient. What's the continuing care plan? And realistically, a full process is going to be a couple of years before people are steady in their recovery and have addressed the majority of their issues. I know that was for me too. So what kind of structure is set up, network in people's lives that are going to support the new recovery lifestyle? Because we have a culture, I think we have a culture of using certainly alcohol, but as marijuana becomes more prevalent in their conversations, just the acceptance of that. You can look at other states, we'll get into all of that. But certainly it is a long-term process that a network is going to have to be developed to support people in their recovery. Barriers that I see is a lot of what Pablo was talking about. We have Medicaid funded facilities in the state of Kansas that either are so full that there are waiting lists or they are restricting admissions due to the lack of availability of addictions counselors to meet that need. The Medicaid rates, while they have increased somewhat, they're still nowhere near the cost of providing effective treatment. And so I think that's a huge barrier and challenge that the state's going to have to face. People that are not insured, I know a lot of people that don't have any insurance don't necessarily qualify for Medicaid, and that number is pretty significant. I know that I think we had 180 referrals for Medicaid placement last year, and they went on a waiting list. I had another 190 some people that called seeking help that had no insurance whatsoever. So the need is growing. It continues to grow. But what do we have in place that is going to, number one, get them into a program? And time is of the essence, right? So it's not that we can't find a resolution or a solution to that, but it's going to take some time. And anybody that's in active addiction that reaches out to seek help, there's a small window before you lose them again, and you may not get them back. So I do think some assistance in that area would be great. transportation, homelessness is a big issue for this particular population. How do we wrap those services around? And there's tons of services and that's the big difference between right now and, even 5 years ago, is a number of sober living houses in the Wichita area or throughout the state. And sober living houses are houses where people can move into that are homeless or can't return to their community or their home because their family is in active addiction. The technology that is out there, telehealth has been around for a while, but the cared for social apps, the connectivity and alumni groups, all of that is significantly improved in the last several years, specifically in the last 5. Can't think anything else unless you have any. Yeah, that's good.
Clayton, thank you. We'll pause there. And any questions for Clayton from the committee? Sandra?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to say to both of you, I really appreciate you coming and sharing your expertise and your story. I do think it's incredibly helpful for us. Even those of us who've worked in this business a really long time, it's always a good reminder to hear the impact of this disease. Clayton, you mentioned the impact on family. And so my question to both of you is, while I would agree the resources for folks in addiction for treatment are slim, especially if you don't have resources, it's even slimmer for family members. And so I'm curious what opportunities you think we have as a board to support families whose loved ones are in active addiction or who are new in recovery. What guidance would you give us about families and kids?
Clayton, do you offer family services at your facility?
Yeah, we do a family day. I think it's generally industry practice that there's going to be some sort of family programming. But again, that's the 21 days that they're here. So maybe you get 3 weekends of that. The long-term, support, you can receive some support in outpatient services, and that certainly should be something that's a part of that treatment plan. But there are significant support groups out there for like Al-Anon, which is a 12-step support group for family members of alcoholics. There's Nar-Anon, which is a support group for family members of recovering addicts. I'm not familiar with any of the other 12-step programs and what are available in terms of that family program, but most of them have it. It's just tapping into that and knowing where those meetings are going to be. So there is support there, but it's hard for most families that they want this situation to be over, and it's just going to take a little bit of time before those relationships get restored and the trust gets rebuilt. Hopefully I answered all your questions, Sandra. I don't know, Pablo, if you have something.
I like everything that Clayton said. That's been my experiences as well. The best thing to heal the family is to heal the addiction. That the more treatment resources there are, the greater odds there are that there's something that that sticks and heals the family. That's been my personal experience, because without that, you just add on new layers of harm and injury to the family circle. So you kind of make a little progress. There's a little hope, but it's not sustainable without targeted resources. And so you add on more things that go south, and then it just expands it, right? So I think that my experience has been that the best source for family support there, while there are groups like Al-Anon and whatnot, is to treat the addict directly, and then that ripples out naturally.
Sandra, I think that's an excellent point. I wrote down family as being something for us to look at. My own experience, and Clayton or Pablo, please chime in, is that perhaps the stigma with the family might even be worse than with the alcoholic. At least in my personal experience and working with families, they're in a very tough spot. I like your analogy with PTSD, because they are in shock and they don't know what to do, and they're mad and sad and all those things at the same time. Lori?
Thank you for your comments. Again, we really appreciate it. I wanted to circle back to your thoughts about recovery housing. And I wonder, what is access to recovery housing like in your experience in Kansas for people who are using medications as part of their recovery?
Yeah. Well, I think you might have some inside information there, because it's difficult. I think 5 years ago, from 5 years to now, the sober living houses, Oxford houses, whatever you want to call them, are more open to it than they used to be, but there's still some hesitancy to have that in the house because it can be abused. We're talking specifically about Suboxone, if you will, which is the opioid, MAT, if you will. That can be abused just like the actual opioid can be abused. And so the sober living houses are not that formal of a structure to where they have like a paid staff member to oversee the administration of those medications or be in charge of that house in a program sense. It's essentially, a bunch of dudes or gals living together in a house with a common belief of recovery. And that houses can get sick, is what they say. Where you've got somebody doing something they're not supposed to in terms of using. So it takes a high level of intensity to ensure that stuff just doesn't come up in the house. But to get back to your question, point blank, I think they're more open to it, but it's going to take a lot longer, I think, for everyone to embrace it.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I just, perhaps as we get, working on all that we have to work on over the next few years, that we could maybe be at the forefront of some guidelines for sober living houses. Because as Clayton said, they're a wonderful organization, but I think there's a couple guys from Kansas City that actually started the Oxford movement years ago, and there's over 4,000 houses in the United States. But so just something to note. So thank you for asking, Lori. There's no other questions. I think we'll move on to our next conferee, Mike Grover. Mike, I know you've spent a lot of time working in the recovery world around the state, and now kind of retired in the Wichita area. So I'll pause there and let you give a little bit of background, and then continue the conversation we've been having.
Okay. Thanks, Pat. Yeah, I feel like a dinosaur, kind of. I got clean myself in 1985 and started working in addiction in 1987. And I took 5 years off. I think I needed a break for a while, but then I came back to work. It's such a great field to work in, to see people recovering, see the miracle of people changing their lives. And then I just retired a year ago. So from full-time, I've worked in residential and almost all the 30 plus years of working in addiction. So I call it being in the trenches. I did a little bit of outpatient counseling, and I've just gone into part-time private practice in the past year, like Pat has mentioned. So I guess my qualifications are, I said I would never drink and drug because I was so I wanted to be a basketball star at Wichita State or KU. They were both really, like they are now, was a big thing when I was in high school. But by the time I graduated from high school, I wasn't even playing because my addiction had started. And I recognized, even though I'd had a problem for about 4 years, I mean, my life was being negatively affected I recognized that I had a problem when I was 19. So that just kind of shows the power of denial, that I went for 4 years before I could see a problem in myself. It's a symptom of addiction is to blame other things around us, blame other people or situations, and see ourselves as a victim. And I don't think it's well, that's just denial is just a central core of addiction. And then it was another, so that was at 19 and I was 31 when I got clean. So that's a dozen years of addiction, of knowing that I had a problem. Um, I think the biggest thing that's ever happened in my life, and I have gotten married and I've had kids and grandkids and got a graduate degree in recovery and um, the most important thing that's ever happened to me was accepting that I was an addict. That was the most life-changing thing for me. So when I think about that, I think that how people see themselves, there's really a spectrum of that. And I see myself and really I think the Clayton and the Pablo and Pat we're kind of maybe one of the more extreme ends where it's really recovery from addiction is a central thing in our life. I know for me, it's the most important thing that there is that I'm an addict and I have to take care of it. And I compare it to diabetes. If I can take care of it and treat it, then I'm going to be able to experience life to the fullest that I choose to make out of it. But if I don't take care of that, then nothing else is going to work out for me. We're real good at shooting ourselves in the foot. So, it really is it's great when people buy into that thought. I mean, we really do see success when people recognize and admit that there's a problem and then want to do something about it, go to that far end of uh, really emphasizing recovery. But I don't think the percentage of that, and I don't have data to support this, but there's a lot of people that just sort of like me for years was I knew I had a drug problem, which is a big difference than saying I'm an addict. So I would say most people fall under the umbrella of um, just of recognize the problem and trying to mitigate it. And I mean that's if that works, then that works. I was taught that abstinence, total abstinence, was the most important thing. Um, um, but not everybody buys into that. So, the process is, and this is really a process. Sometimes it always starts out with some kind of crisis, like running into a truck, uh, or it can be an accumulation of events that lead up to going, boy, I need to do something. So I am so fortunate when I was able to get help. I have been through treatment a couple times. The last time I went through, I had an insurance card that wasn't valid, but they let me in anyway. I don't know what would have, I mean, I wasn't covered. I lost my job because of my addiction. And I don't know what would have happened if I'd had to rely on a non or it was a for-profit agency I was in. Um, what I've seen over the years is that resources are really important. And if you don't have personal resources, that it's difficult. A long time ago, when I worked out at Dodge City at a treatment center, we had a program that was a 45-day addiction treatment center. And when the funding was reduced to a 30-day program, we thought that was horrible. The people that work there, that just because it takes so much time uh, to find that homeostasis or the recovery point. I think Clayton had mentioned how it takes a few years, and I really agree with that. There is a steep learning curve to start out, but it takes so much support, and I will agree with in the rural areas, because I've lived in Dodge City and Larned in recovery, and I know there's just not much available unless you go to the more urban areas. And even here in Wichita, there's not a place. I believe that if you don't have insurance, um, the place that you go to for detox here in Wichita, there's not very many beds, and they don't have, and I'm not even sure if they have medication to help out. When I first started working in this business in '87, I worked at a detox center that was city funded in Wichita. And what we gave for people that was going through detox was uh, honey. I think it was honey and aspirin. I mean, there was just not much. And then we'd just wait for them to have a seizure from withdrawal, and we'd call ambulances. And I kind of think that that's what the situation. I'm not sure the medication that they give, but I think it's the availability for help is limited. I work with a number of people here in town, and I know it's just if you don't have insurance, it's difficult to get in. I think the most important thing. I mean, this is kind of a micro view of it, but in order for most people, I think, to get clean, there really has to be some personal connections of somebody somebody that they can trust and they can believe is working in their best interest, and has some stability in their life to help guide in recovery. So we've talked about the residential program and the follow-up care and continuing care. I'm so old that when I went through treatment, they had a halfway house, which I'm not sure. There probably is some in Kansas, but the recovery houses are much more available, and I think, boy, they've helped a lot of people. But there is, without the professional help there, like Clayton said, sometimes that they go bad. But I went to a halfway house. There was professional staff there that really added some stability, and that was a good thing for me. I did have some skills. Even I was able to graduate college for the first time during my addiction. It took a long time and dropping in and out over a few years, but um, I just see so many people today that were come from a family of addiction that just really lack basic coping skills. I've heard that we talk about rehabilitation. Uh, there's a number of people that have never been habilitated in the first place, so it's going to take a lot of support for somebody coming from that background, somebody that has parents that are in addiction. I mean, it's a generational problem. So I do think availability. My heart goes out to the people that don't have the resources, the unemployed, or just low income families. There's also the problem that, I mean, there's health conditions that have to be taken care of. Um, and then we've talked about the family. That is so huge. It's all connected together. I'm working with a guy now that he's been clean for a half a year. His wife is still just so mistrustful and hateful, and I mean it's completely understandable. I've told patients you can't, a family member that has years and years of being angry and hurt and afraid day after day after day, that they're going to be affected. PTSD is a great description of that. So to give the addict the resources to be able to cope with that, and then for when the family member does finally become if the sober person is able to cope with that and stay sober and changes their life, at some point the family member is going to recognize that they need help too, that the addict is doing better, but they're not. So I think availability of services is real key. Addicts are terribly difficult bunch to work with. I mean, even working in the industry here, I see professionally trained, beautiful, caring treatment people become frustrated even at times too. So, addicts are just come from a history of having to deny and lie and cover up and blame, and that doesn't change once the drugs stop. So I think it is so stressful for the frontline workers. What I've seen over the years is that more and more is expected of them without giving more resources. So I think the resources that go into treatment centers, and I work with people in the medical field, that great nurses, ER workers, and they talk about how people in those places speak so disparagingly of addicts and alcoholics. I mean, we look terrible on the outside when we're using. We look like we don't care. We look like we're completely self-centered, and we're really good people. But addiction has just taken such a control over lives that the support that we need for the frontline people is really important to be able to provide the best care that we can. So I could talk for a long time, but I better limit it.
Yeah, thank you for your words and just your personal challenges, and certainly you echoed what Pablo and Clayton said about the family and how important that is. And, something for our committee as we go forward to keep that in mind, because not only are they affected, but then they're a key ingredient to the recovery and the solution. Thank you very much, Mike. Any questions of Mike or comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's Monica.
Yeah, Monica.
Thanks, Mike, for sharing with us, and also to Pablo and Clayton. Thanks. I really appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
I'd like to push you a little more on specifics of frontline staff and what they need. So just to kind of put it in what I'm getting at. So I work in schools, right? And teachers say, wow, I need this support around me because this is different, right? I think I hear you saying that we need those extra supports in facilities and in all areas. Can you give us some specifics of what that would look like? If you were king for the day, what is that support?
Yeah, that's just for me, from look that it's so easy that we just need more counselors. The caseloads have become so much, and the paperwork requirements have increased as time has gone on. So I think reducing caseloads would be good. Just like we need, I mean, the nurse one of the nurses I work with talks about how he's got so many people that he has to take care of in the hospital that it inhibits. And to me, the personal connection every recovery story is different. It's a personal story, and the human connection is so key that if I've only got 5 minutes for you, that's not going to happen. And it, somehow miracles happen where patients will talk to other patients. That happens, but I just know how professional staff has helped me out over the years, and I've seen that happen. And the same thing with teachers. It's such I mean, there's a lot of similarities there. That if I have too much to do, I can't make that intimate connection with the person that really.
So anything that puts more humans on the job to do the things they know how to do. So whether that's increase in billing, increased in, funding to hire more people or different types of people. Okay.
Yes, I think more good people is key, and that seems. I mean, I know in this day and age, that seems like an overwhelming order to do. I mean, everything applies to that in all areas, that we're doing more with less. I don't know if artificial intelligence is going to work for working with drug addiction, but I don't think it's going to. I think that authentic human connection, maybe I'm just old school, but I think that is key. And you've probably seen that with students too.
Thank you.
Yes.
Mike or Clayton, have you had experience working with peer support? I know that's relatively new in some respect, in the olden days, but still today in the AA model of having a sponsor / mentor, that provides that personal connection after, say, treatment, and the peer support, the little bit that I've been around, that seems like it perhaps is a step in the right direction of any, if you have experience, please expound.
Well, I think nowadays, yeah, peer support, but I think nowadays they call them recovery coaches. I'm not saying that's an official term, but
Right.
I think the industry is moving towards recovery coaches in that peer role. But the peer support is typically a part of the Medicaid state-funded facilities. I think it's effective. I know in the commercial insurance world, it's recovery coaching.
Thank you.
Yes, I've seen. I'll just say that you don't have to be a master's level person to provide help. I mean, that shows up in the 12-step organizations. Um, so I'm all for peer support or recovery coaches, because I've even seen, just working, I've had a lot of experience in residential. I've seen housekeepers have a positive influence. I've seen cooks have a positive influence, maintenance people, caring people making connections is really powerful.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mike? Thank you very much, Mike, for your time. And if you want to hold on, we'll move to Chris. I believe Chris, he joined us a little bit late, but I believe he's with us, and from the West Coast, I believe. Or are you on the East Coast today?
Yes, sir.
Chris has a long history of working in the field and at a national level, but also at a personal level. And very excited to hear from you today. If you want to give a couple minutes of background, and then just your experience with barriers, or what you see that's working, or just any observation, and then we'll take some questions. So Chris, welcome.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and distinguished members of the board. I have to confess to you that I was very, very nervous last night and this morning, thinking about sharing any remarks with you at all. And I'll share two things about that. The first thing is that nervousness and that high anxiety did not translate into me waking up and drinking whiskey. It translated into me waking up and having a cup of coffee and shaving and taking a shower. More on that later. The second thing that occurred to me was you have joined a human conversation that has been going on since the time of recorded history, that accelerated in this country after the Opium Wars in 1839, when Britain grabbed control of the opium trade in America, and has continued until today. Your state, your group, your communities are all part of that conversation at this point. And I think that you're also handling the great responsibility of once in a generation means to do something about something that has claimed so many lives and inflicted so much suffering. So sort of feeling you guys as that group and the seriousness of your enterprise, I was really hard pressed to try to think about what I could say about my experience, or what I've learned since entering the field and being given the gift of sobriety, that would be helpful. Let me begin with somebody a lot smarter than me. Albert Einstein, and I have to look at this. I was reminded of a quote yesterday by someone who's a wonderful speaker who said, "Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted." And I thought a long time about that. What does that really mean? It means that in the face of what you think you believe or what you know you believe, whether it's opinion or conviction or preliminary thought, in the middle of all the empirical evidence that'll sit in front of this committee, and I know you're going to gather a ton of it, there's always a duty, there's always a responsibility to ask the deeper question. And in asking that deeper question, the real question is, where do you ask it? And who do you ask it of? Do you ask it from voices from history? Or do you ask it from voices in the present? Or do you ask it from people in the present who are talking about the future? The other part of feeling the weight of the responsibility of being with you today begins for me at the age of 12, when my job as a third child in an Irish-English family was to run down the driveway and get a beer out of the refrigerator for my dad, proud veteran of the Marine Corps, 4 bloody battles, bore the wounds of war in the most graceful and prolific way. What I was entitled to do when I got back up to the house was take a sip before I'd hand it over to him. And I have to tell you, at that stage and age of my life, in 1970, when that stuff hit me and went through the blood-brain barrier into my limbic system, everything slowed down. That Irish-English DNA was perfectly suited for it. Life was clear, life was calm, I could see everything. And of course, being a child, you understand that euphorogenic effect, while it's not understandable scientifically, is understandable emotionally. Now overlay that with a culture in the 60s and the 70s that celebrated alcohol and nicotine use. It was either a sanctioning of your manhood, or it was a thing to be consumed proudly when you had an achievement, or it was something to be consumed in movies and books, and family life showed you this when there was a hard time, right? Hey, I just had a bad day, give me one. All 3 of those cultural messages were powerful in shaping at least me to believe that this was an iconic substance to be celebrated. Fast forward again to the point where all of that alcohol use found me sitting on a bed in a hospital, believing that life was over, career was over, family was over, any opportunity to do anything again was over. And what happened? 2 things happened. The first was a nurse who looked to me to be about 85 years old came and sat on a bed next to me and put her arm around me and said, "How you feeling?" I said, "Not great. No hope here. There's never going to be anything for me in life again." She said, "Well, you're a good man." And that's not true. And she got up and she walked away. The second thing that happened, and Pat knows this because we, share our experiences as cradle Catholics, was a priest who became my sponsor, who has now gone to God, walked down the hall with his size 13 shoes. He was a very, very large guy. I could hear his feet coming and I knew what I was in for. And he dropped a blue Bible on my desk and said, "Read the gospel." And he walked away. Those 2 events began a journey for me where I was able to find a commitment to not work in counseling, not work in direct care, not work in medicine, but to work in systems, to always ask the question, what's working here, what's not working here? Why are we doing what we're doing? And how do we do it better? How do we get more people into treatment? How do we get more funding so that we can get the state-of-the-art things that we need to administer the approved addiction medications, the things that we need to have peers support all this, the ways that we can connect to primary care, the ways that we can use, medical records and data to begin to understand people completely. And I have been asking the question since that moment that I entered sobriety and entered this business about why every time we admit someone, are we not just deepening and gaining our understanding of their children and their spouse? What can we do to get that understanding? Because there is no question that this is a family disease. By the way, so is cancer. We have tons of research in this country that shows if a family is properly equipped, supported, taught, loved, and worked with, when somebody has cancer, the quality of life years for the cancer carrier increases by at least 20%. So the family question that you raised today is terribly important. A couple other things I wanted to point out to this group, just to in that spirit of, let's ask the deeper question. I looked into, before I came to you today, every single thing that's going on in the University of Kansas health system in behavioral health. Here's what I found. You started one of the first OTP programs in the country in the 1960s. Dr. Gabrielli was a pioneer. He recognized that things had to be done, that had to be addressed, that people needed to be cared for, and he did it. They are working with the emergency departments in Kansas City and Olathe right now, taking care of an average census of 500 people. They've got the addiction fellowship, they've got the trainees, they've got this network where they can proudly stand as your hospital. I believe Pat's still owned by the state. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But that is a system that has tons and tons and tons of learning and data about your community. And it's got to be paid attention to. The system that Mike and Clayton work in, the system that Pablo is beginning his journey to work in, all of it has data about the experiences of the people who have come through the door. The other thing that I wanted to point out to this group is there are some new things emerging that I think are profound, again, in understanding a person's propensity to use drugs or alcohol. I call your attention to the work of Robert Gibbons at the University of Chicago and the Research Triangle Group, RTI. They have essentially developed computerized testing that is, friendly to consumers. The government just finished a $30 million study on it at SAMHSA. Those study results are not out yet. But imagine if we've been measuring people for anxiety, depression, and trauma with a PHQ-9 scale test. This is like a PHQ 400 that is statistically designed to give you insight to the person's propensity to use. Think about the child in the family where you just admitted the father, and the person's current state of mental, physical health that we can address and diagnose. That's a breakthrough. That is coming down the pike as something that's going to give us that deeper look into somebody and where they are now. Is it going to be perfect? Not by any means. No measurement ever is. But is it going to give us a better look at what's going on with the person and give us the ability to ask more questions? Yes. Where should we be looking? Well, I said to Pat before this, we should be looking at everybody who has surgery in the state of Kansas that gets prescribed an opioid to take home. How do we accompany them as they go out of the OR and into the home setting? And how do we work with them to understand that that substance that they're carrying has, from the beginning of time, hooked people and left them in a position of needing deep help and treatment? Where else can we look? Let's go to the school level because I was fascinated by that exchange and that question. Schools generally will think of themselves as places that want to do everything they can to help people. to help students get in a position to learn. I was blessed with a mother who was a teacher, and I watched her every single day go above and beyond what what her job was to try to get students enough food, a right piece of clothing, the right extra help to be able to do what they needed to do to succeed academically. I think that as we are equipping those folks, and rightly said, more resources, more people to accompany children, we have to equip them with the right thing and then connect them back to primary care, psychiatric resources, and the other resources. The last thing I would want for that school worker is that they've understood a child completely and that they can't get that child the help they need when they need it. So access to care. The last thing that I would urge this group is, we're tempted when we look for solutions to be sort of nationally centric or state centric. The world's a big place, and we're not the only people in the world struggling with the opium scourge, as it was called in the early 1900s. So expand your view into the international realm and see what's going on there. And I think every single thing you find will at least inform your thinking and prompt other questions. The delivery system in Kansas, as it has existed, and the delivery system in America as it has existed, as I was reminded many, many times throughout my career, only takes care of 10% of the people who need help. I would love to see the good people of Kansas take that reality, smash through it, and make sure that many, many more people get into the help that they need or are prevented from ever needing help at all. Pat, that's about my limit on time. I just want to say thank you to you again. Pat knows that my ongoing trauma in life is the play of the Buffalo Bills, but we'll leave that off the table today. And just want to thank you and the committee for the opportunity to spend some time with you today.
Chris, thank you for your comments and thank you for your work in the field. I know you've made a big difference in a lot of lives, actually saved lives, and just giving back what was given to you. And being at the level that you work at, it's refreshing both today and other times when in time to conversation with you to learn new things. I think your point about looking internationally, because this disease knows no boundaries, and who knows, maybe there's something they're doing in Sweden or Chile or whatever, wherever, that we could incorporate and make a difference. That's our charge. I feel all of us members of this board feel the same way. So any questions or comments of Chris?
I do, Mr. Chair. It's Monica. Hey, thanks for visiting with us today. 2 questions for you. Number one, I see in your bio, you've worked in the world of federally qualified health centers. In Kansas, we have quite a few that are the answer to substance use treatment. They are the safety net in many counties in Kansas. I'd like to know your thoughts on how we could make the best use of that safety net. And then number 2, if you got a call and said you get to spend the money, how would you spend it?
Oh, geez. The second one's really tough. The first one is something I can speak a little more readily to. The FQHCs, along with the Kennedy era community mental health centers, are some of the greatest movements, policy movements this country's ever seen. The genius of the FQHC, it always seemed to me, Monica, was they get paid out a prospective payment system, right? You submit a budget. This is what we're going to need for the year, and you get funded based on that, less whatever you're able to bill and that sort of thing. The opportunities for real integration. I mean, when I think about that expression, one healthcare lane, I think about walking into one place where I can see a psychiatrist. I can see an interventional psychiatrist if I'm feeling, no success with medication for depression. I can see a mental health therapist. I can see an SUD therapist. There's a med clinic where all the medications get managed. And, I'm looked after and making sure that there's no conflict in my medications and that sort of thing. There's case managers and health navigators and doctors and nurses who are on a mission. And all I had to do, even if I was poor, was just walk in and then be, summon all my strength and summon all the family support I have to be a good patient, right? I think that model was mimicked with the community, the community CCBHC Behavioral Health Center movement. Same PPS model, at least at the outset. And I think those are tremendously effective things as long as we can get the workforce to commit to it. People in the workforce tend to commit to it. I come from a family of docs, grandfather a doc, brother a doc, youngest kid a doc, who reminds me I shouldn't eat donuts. But I watch those models and I watch how they're able to flex around those models, translation services, things like that. I may have answered my question in that description. How would I spend the money? More connections, right? If UK is doing this, that, and the other, how do you drop a CCBHC, FQHC model in the middle of that in X, Y, and Z sites around the state? And I'd also say one more thing. As you see in my bio, I sat with the SAMHSA folks on the advisory council for a few years. I would also say this: when we start talking about the exciting things that can really make a difference with new diagnostics and new treatments and that sort of thing, we tend to forget that the Clayton Carrs of the world are standing the watch, and the Mike Grovers are standing the watch in very rural places, making a do with a little bit of stuff where they get a lot done. That is part of the safety net. I argued this at SAMHSA for years. We need to understand that that is the safety net right now, right? And as we're doing new stuff, we got to make sure that that new stuff brings these folks along. That's kind of my thought on it.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate that.
Great points. Any other questions or comments for Mike? Chris, thank you. And the theme throughout all four of the presentations seems to ring through the continuity of care and the one-stop shop. I know I've done some work specifically, with bringing in the physical health. There's some resistance there, and stigma gets in the way of my part of my annual physical should include some sort of mental health, assessment and substance use. And I think you hit on that, Chris, in a couple of different areas. And, I appreciate your acknowledgement that we have a lot to look at, but we are at a point, and plus we have the funds to hopefully make a difference. So, Chris and Mike and Clayton and Pablo, thank you very much. Before they leave, I think everybody's still on as far as the conferees. Is there any questions from the committee or any comments before they leave?
I have a quick one, Mr. Chair. Sorry, and it's for Pablo if he's still available. Pablo, specific to Southwest Kansas and issues of language and culture, everybody considers just that things fall into place, and they don't. And my gut tells me they especially don't if you speak Spanish as your first language, or your any other language, insert whatever dialect. It gets harder and harder and harder. Is that true? Is that your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely, with a capital A and an exclamation point. I'm bilingual, and so understand the kind of the cultural, the linguistic parts of it, and you've got just these structural barriers that come into play where if you need treatment, where do you go? I have no idea where you go. Where you've got a Spanish speaking counselor, staff, and you could receive medical treatment. anything at all is an improvement. You do just have a lot naturally, like in Dodge City and probably Garden City and Liberal, in that kind of triangle in Southwest Kansas of people who are bilingual because they grew up in a Hispanic household and they happen to work at a facility or in the field. I mean, it's really common, but there's also like these just the cultural that make things difficult, like you're working manual labor and you don't have insurance. It again comes back to the same kind of core deal that you don't have access to resources, you don't have the type of employment that produces or provides those resources. So yeah, I don't know where to even start on saying what the solution should be. I just know anything would be a step up because it's absolutely a targeted group.
Thanks for that.
Thank you. Seeing no other.
I have one question.
Okay,
sorry.
Lori. Sure, go right ahead.
This is for any of you, and would really appreciate your insight into how we can potentially invite some folks with lived in experience who have perhaps more recently accessed the system of care in Kansas, newer in their recovery and have experience using maybe medications to support their recovery, or have experience with care for some opioid use disorders in particular. Have any thoughts about how we can encourage folks like that to come and speak? Value everything you have all said, and it would also be good to hear from people, I think, who have tried to access care in the last couple of years to see where we are today.
Lori, I'll take a swing at that. And this isn't really my idea. It's from somebody I was privileged enough to work with, Dave Gustafson. Find somebody who's recently failed in treatment twice and get them in and ask them why.
Thank you. Yeah, there's nothing that beats the real world.
I'd like to throw something in on that with what Chris just said. So, typically a patient or a client is going to come to a residential facility, and we're hoping, half the time they're going to leave and they're going to stay sober and they're going to stay clean for a fair amount of time, if not the rest of their lives. But those patients or clients that come back, the reality is you're going to have a more structured program. You're going to have to possibly do the sober living or even a longer term program. And that is a huge commitment for someone to say, okay, I'm going to take the next year, 18 months out of my life and essentially disconnect from my life before, possibly a new industry, a new employment area. And so that is a significant commitment that people struggle with. So, but that is the answer. It's well, in my experience and observation, it has to be a commitment to a much longer term program. And people are very resistant to that for obvious reasons, cost being one of them. But completely changing, everything you do and how you do it is huge. And not knowing whether you're going to actually stay sober and clean. I don't know if that made any sense. Hopefully it did.
Thank you. Well, thank you again, Clayton and Chris and Pablo and Mike, for taking time this morning to share with the committee. We're going to be at this for a while, years, so don't be surprised if we ask you to come back, and don't be hesitant to offer any suggestions. You guys are out there on the front lines every day dealing with this disease, so we very much welcome your comments in the future as well. With that, committee, we are at the last point of our next meeting will be in April on the 14th. We'll plan on it being live there at the Capitol with the encouragement to be there in person, but that could change. I know one of the topics we want to hone in on is the needs assessment that we'll be doing, you know, make sure that we're asking the right questions, and there might be some of those that you've developed since we last talked about it. I'm sure there'll be further questions about the RFP. We'll have a better idea of the number of applicants at that time, and we'll decide how the review is going to take place. Just an FYI that we can talk about in April would be, there's been some thought about, well, does the board or anyone on the board want to take part in the review process? It's, you know, at one time we thought, well, we would, you know, to be good stewards of the money, it might be well that we would, but you're talking about quite a commitment, and each of us have made a commitment just to be on this board. And so to ask you to spend many more hours in review, you know, we kind of hold the veto card after the review process. We've hired Sunflower to be part of that, and even if they need to bring on some additional help. So that's, you can be thinking about that. It'll be something that we discuss in April. So, and then I believe we've settled on, you know, always subject to change, the second Friday of the month. And I know, I think Connie has reserved the same room there, 152 South at the state capitol, and that's where we'll plan to meet and when we'll meet for the foreseeable future, as well as if we need an additional meetings thrown in there, we'll certainly look at that as well. So with that being said, any comment about meetings or anything around that?
Mr. Chair, this isn't about a meeting specifically, but there was one thing that if I can raise something that I forgot to raise earlier, just a housekeeping matter. I know a handful of the board members were having a little bit of difficulty accessing their internet, or excuse me, not internet, but their email, their AG issued email. I was working with IT to try to get that resolved. It looks like the best approach is going to be to just have you directly work with IT to get that resolved. But if you don't have that contact information or don't know exactly who to call, if you could reach out to Connie, she can put you in contact with me, and we can get you connected with IT and get that issue resolved. So we want to get that working, but I just want to kind of make certain we get you connected as quick as we can.
Thank you, Chris. Any other comment? Thanks to everybody for your time. You know, I feel like we're slow getting ramped up. I know checking around with other states, we seem to be kind of where a lot of states are. We have a big responsibility and a big opportunity to make a difference. So I know everybody's busy, but in my world, I feel the same from your worlds, is that, you know, we can make a difference in saving lives and saving families. So I very much appreciate your time, and kudos to the staff for keeping us on target and you know, doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Certainly appreciate the staff and all that you do. And with that, I adjourn the meeting. Thank you.